Yes.
Okay. All right, so yeah, so as I said, we're moving into plants. So today we've got a lecture on the basic structure of plants and the different functions that different portions of the plant have. So let's talk a little bit about plant organs. So animals have a lot more organ systems than plants do. Plants basically only have 4 major organ systems, and those are leaves, roots, stems, and flowers. So we're going to start with a little talk to your neighbor about what you already know about plants. Think about the primary functions of these 4 organ systems. And you can talk to your neighbor about that.
Well, the
Stems are for gathering nutrients. Leaves are like photosynthesis. Flowers, stems, transport stuff. That's like the basic arrangement.
yeah,
Do you agree or disagree?
I indubitably agree. Everything you said.
Yeah, it's like
I didn't know she had the review sheets ready, or I would have printed them so I could leave notes.
All right, so what do you guys think? What's the primary function of leaves in a plant?
Photosynthesis.
Photosynthesis. And why is photosynthesis important for plants?
Helps them respirate.
Respiration is a different process. It's kind of the opposite of photosynthesis, actually, if you're talking about cellular respiration. So what are you actually doing when you're photosynthesizing? You're doing what? Fixing carbon, yes. Yes, so so that's basically how plants are getting their food. That's how they're making their carbon-based molecules that they then are used to build themselves and to respirate. So they do need to make those carbon-based molecules in order to go through respiration, but that's where those are actually coming from, through that photosynthetic process where you're fixing carbon from the atmosphere. So yeah, that's the primary function of most leaves. There are exceptions, there's exceptions to everything, but that's the primary function for most leaves. What about roots? So getting nutrients from the soil, yep, that's an important function. What else? Yeah, holding on to the soil so you don't go anywhere, yeah, exactly. So those are the primary functions for roots, yep. What about stems?
Support.
What do you mean by, yeah, so, yeah, but I would put more with, more just like structural support. But I mean, I guess technically they do grow, but I'm not sure that's the function of a stem. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Is it the stem part that helps the plant face the sun, like that turns towards the flower?
Yeah, well, the petiole, which is the base of the leaf, can orient the stem. I think the petiole orient the leaf. I think the petiole technically counts as part of the leaf, though.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Transports like nutrients throughout the.
Yeah, so you got support and transport are the major functions of the stem. There are exceptions to that as well. There are some stems that are photosynthetic, for example. All right, and then what about flowers? Reproduction, exactly. So when you give someone a bouquet of flowers, you're giving them a bouquet of reproductive structures. That's funny thing. Once you start thinking about that, it's very amusing. Or at least I find it. So yeah, so this is basically what we just went over. You got your leaves, which are mostly doing photosynthesis. You got your roots, which are holding onto the soil and absorbing nutrients. You got your stems that are going to be supporting the structure of the plant, and then the flowers, which are the reproductive structures. You can also divide these different organs into 2 different systems: the shoot system, which is basically everything that's above ground, and the root system, which is basically everything that's below ground. So that's basically what I want to say about that. So let's go through these different, we're not going to talk much about flowers today because we have a whole thing on plant reproduction starting tomorrow. But we'll talk about these other structures. Roots, of course, are super important. In fact, because roots are where the plant gets its micronutrients, and roots are also where the plant gets its water from, they're an extremely critical component of survival. So when a plant starts to grow from a seed, we're talking about a seed plant, the first thing that grows is actually the root. Because before the plant can do anything else or start photosynthesizing or do anything, it needs to be able to get access to water. So the first root that comes out of the seed is actually called the radicle. This is the radicle right here. And we're going to talk more about plant growth in another lecture, but plants actually have cell division in limited tissues. Not every tissue in the plant divides, and if you think about it, plants have cell walls, right? They have that hard cellulose cell wall. So that makes it very difficult for a mature plant cell to divide because they already are surrounded by the cell wall. So you have the division only in particular places. So in the root, that's called the cell division is taking place at the apical meristem. So right here at the tip of the root. And then you have those cells, as they divide, gradually go through a period of elongation where they get longer, and then they mature and start to differentiate as they get older and older. And so this root, as it grows, is going to be pushing through the soil. The root tip is protected by a root cap, which is basically just a layer of cells that, if you're pushing through the soil, you don't want to damage the cells that are dividing, so you have that root cap that covers those cells. As the cells differentiate and mature, you tend to get a lot of these root hairs. Root hairs are really important for plants because they increase the surface area of the root. Why do you need to increase the surface area of the root?
To absorb more water.
Exactly. So if you have a greater surface area, you can absorb more things from the soil. You have more surface in contact with the soil, and that's going to allow you to absorb things more efficiently. Okay. So all of those things are important. All right. So here's, now we're going to move on to stems. If you're looking at stems, most stems are made up of a repeating structure. And so they have sections where there are what we call nodes, where you have leaves or additional stems or flowers attached, and then you have internode areas where there's nothing attached. And they repeat the structure over and over. So you have a node here with a leaf and a bud, and then you have an internode where there's nothing, and then you have another node with a leaf and a bud, and then an internode and a node and internode. And that repeating section is very, very typical for most stems. There's two different types of buds. Again, like the root, cell division is only happening in particular locations. And so cell division is really only happening in these areas that have buds. So you have the axillary bud or the terminal bud. Sorry, not axillary bud. The axillary buds are the ones on the side here. The terminal bud is the one at the end. The terminal bud contains the apical meristem. So like there's apical meristem in the root, there's also apical meristem in the terminal bud. So there's cell division happening there. Cell division can also occur in these axillary buds, and we'll talk more about when that happens and when it doesn't. A lot of times these axillary buds are dormant as long as the terminal bud is intact, but if the terminal bud gets damaged, then these axillary buds can actually grow. Also, the axillary buds produce, like if you have a tree that drops its leaves for part of the season, the axillary buds can produce new leaves or flowers or a new side sheet, depending on what kinds of environmental exposures they have. Any questions about those? Okay, and then leaves. So leaves are primarily the photosynthesis engine, so they're making all that sugar that the plant needs to survive. The two major components of the leaf are the blade, which is the broad part here. This is the blade. And then the petiole, which is the little stem that supports the blade. And some plants actually can shift the origin or the orientation of their leaves depending on the time of day. So this is an example of a plant that in the morning, When the sun first comes up, it actually will orient its leaves towards the rising sun to get a greater amount of light striking the leaf. That's the purpose of having a broad blade, is that you have a greater surface area that you can expose to the light, so you can have more photosynthesis. So during the morning, they point those leaves so that the flat part is pointed at the sun so they can get more photosynthesis. In the middle of the day, when the sun is really strong, and they have to worry about water loss, because plants do have to worry about water loss, they actually will orient their leaves in a vertical orientation, so that when the sun is coming straight down, it's not striking a large portion of the leaf, and that keeps the leaf from getting hot, which would cause a lot of water loss. And actually, this particular species, at nighttime, the leaves just droop, so they actually they kind of sleep. Sort of. Yeah.
Why do you certain, and I have a project where it actually closes up during the night.
The leaves close up?
That's interesting.
It could be a protection from predation potentially. If you don't have your leaves out, then maybe they're left available. There are a number of plants that actually will close their leaves when things try to eat them. So that's a possible hypothesis. I'm not 100% sure. That's an interesting question. I'm not super familiar with plants that close their leaves at night. But they don't need to photosynthesize, so I guess maybe, it might also be that they're just less susceptible to mechanical damage at night if you're in a smaller area than if some large funky animal is going by, you're less likely to get stepped on or tromped on or something. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's, if you are not currently photosynthesizing, you don't need to be spread out. If you pick up a smaller area, you're less susceptible to mechanical damage. Other questions? All right, so that's leaves. All right, so let's take a closer look at the leaf here. So there's multiple cell layers in the leaf. We're not going to go into too much detail about photosynthesis and how that works because it's very heavy on the cellular molecular side, but we're going to kind of touch on it generally. If you're looking at a particular leaf, what you tend to see is that you have your cuticle. What does the cuticle do?
Prevents water loss.
Prevents water loss. So it's a waxy layer on the outside of the cells that prevents water loss. If you've got a waxy layer, what do you need to have?
Stomata?
Yeah, you gotta have some gaps in it, the stomata. Sometimes they have them in the top, but oftentimes they're in the bottom of the leaf. They have these stomata here that are surrounded by cells called guard cells. Those guard cells can actually open and close. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So these provide little holes into the leaf through which gas exchange can occur. So if you're going to be fixing carbon, you need to get carbon dioxide into the leaf. So that is definitely something that is going to be necessary for the plant. So you're going to have carbon dioxide diffusing in. At the same time, you're going to have water, the water vapor that's diffusing out. So you get evaporation within the leaf, and that water vapor is going to leave. So it's a trade-off. If you have your stomata open, you can bring that carbon dioxide in, which is good, but you're also losing water, which is potentially bad depending on what environment you're in. So there's a trade-off to having your stomata open. Most of the photosynthesis that's happening in the plant is happening in these middle cells called the mesophyll cells. Generally, there's two layers of mesophyll cells, some that are tightly packed and some that are more spongy. These spongy ones, they just provide air gaps for carbon dioxide to get in and diffuse around to all the various cells that need it. Also in the leaf, if it's a true leaf, there are going to be vascular tissue bundles. Vascular tissue bundles are the transport systems for the plant. So remember, bulk transport is something that plants do. We're going to be talking about that a lot more today. So that's another thing that is going to be present in a true leaf. Any questions about leaf structure? Okay. All right. So I was saying true leaf. What is the difference between a rhizoid.
What'd you say?
See.
All right, click in if you haven't clicked. Anybody else? Okay. All right, so this is just a definition type of thing. If for something to be considered a true leaf or a true root, it must contain vascular tissue. Leaf-like structures and rhizoids have the same functions as leaves and roots, but they don't have complex vascular tissue. So if you're looking at like a bryophyte, for an example, a moss, if you look closely at a moss, you'll see that they have these little things that look like leaves, but technically they are not a leaf because bryophytes are a non-vascular plant. They don't have any complex vascular tissue. Same thing goes if you go and you pull up a moss and you look at the stuff that was underground, you'll see something that looks root-like, but technically those are rhizoids because they don't have any vascular tissue, okay? So that's the true difference between leaf-like structures and leaves and rhizoids and roots, okay? But the leaf-like structures and the rhizoids are basically serving the same function. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this vascular tissue, because I keep on referring to it. There's two types of vascular tissue in plants. You have xylem and phloem. The xylem is primarily responsible for transporting water and minerals. And generally the xylem is going to be flowing from the roots to the leaves. So the xylem is generally always going up the plant, because the plant is always going to be getting its water from the soil and then moving it around all the different parts of the plant that need water. The phloem, on the other hand, mostly transports carbohydrates, so sugars and such. And of course it does also transport water because there needs to be something for those sugars to be dissolved in. But the primary function of the phloem is to transport those sugars. It also can transport things like hormones that help the plant to coordinate its growth and development. And phloem can move in multiple directions. So it always moves from sugar sources to sugar sinks. So what that means is from somewhere that has sugar to somewhere that needs sugar, okay? So most of the time, where is there going to be sugar, a lot of sugar?
Leaves?
In the leaves, exactly. So most of the time, the plant is doing photosynthesis. It's going to be producing sugar in its leaves. Can its roots make sugar?
No.
No, it can't. They can't. And they need sugar to do the basic, they break down sugar and make ATP and do the basic cell thing. So they still you need to feed your roots. So the phloem will transport sugar from the leaves to the roots most of the time. There are some exceptions. Think about a maple tree early in the spring. Are they photosynthesizing? No, they don't have any leaves yet. Maple trees drop their leaves, right? So if they want to grow new leaves, what do they need to do? Get sugar where?
Soil? No?
Well, it turns out that throughout the whole year, maple trees are making a bunch of sugar and they're storing it in their root system. So they put it away down in their root system, and then they need to bring it up from their root system back out to the branches so that they can grow new leaves.
Mm-hmm.
So, who's ever eaten maple syrup? What's happening, the way you harvest maple syrup is in the early spring, right before the leaves start to grow. You drill a little hole into the phloem of the maple tree, and as that phloem is moving from the roots, carrying sugar from the roots up to the top of the tree, you can tap the tree and collect some of that liquid. So you get this sugary liquid from the maple tree, and then you boil the crap out of it because it's actually not super concentrated. So you boil it for a really, really, really long time, time, and then all the sugars get concentrated, and that's how they make maple syrup. But if you're ever out on the East Coast or anywhere where there's a maple tree and there's like a broken branch, in early spring, if it's a cold morning, sometimes the sap will like come out of the broken branch and form a little icicle, and you can break them off, and you can suck on them, and they're actually a little bit sweet. They're kind of cool. So if you ever happen to run across a maple tree that's doing that, they're pretty neat. All right. Questions about that? About xylem or phloem? So the way I remember this, I don't have a good mnemonic for xylem, but the phloem transports food. So phloem food, xylem, I don't know. I don't know how you're going to remember xylem. But if you remember phloem food, then hopefully you'll remember the xylem is water. All right, so let's take a closer look at the xylem. The xylem is basically like straws. It is a hollow tube that runs throughout the entire length of the plant, and the cells that make up the xylem are actually dead when they're mature. So when they first grow, they are alive, but eventually they die and they just leave the cell walls behind. So there's no cell membranes, and so it is just like a straw. Water can just flow up and down that tube with no problem. Depending on what type of plant you're looking at, so whether you're looking at a gymnosperm or an angiosperm, the structures that you have are a little bit different. So in gymnosperms, you have what are called tracheids. Tracheids have, the connections between the tracheids are actually kind of these diagonal sloped connections, and they have little holes that connect each cell. So each individual tracheid like this is a cell, but they've got these tapered tips, and they connect that way. So you can have the water just flow from one to the other. In the angiosperms, you have a structure that's called a vessel element. Vessel elements are a little bit wider, and they can either have a slightly diagonal connection with a plate between them with little pits that water can pass through, or in some vessel elements, there's actually like no division from one cell to the other. So the water can just flow straight through, basically just like a straw. Okay, that make sense? Okay. The phloem, on the other hand, is alive. So it has a cell membrane, and there's a reason, we'll talk about why the phloem has to be alive in a minute, okay, so think about a typical living cell. What's inside the cell?
Nucleus?
Organelles. You get a bunch of membrane-bound organelles. We're talking about eukaryotes here. So we've got like mitochondria, maybe chloroplasts, who's plant cells. There's a nucleus. Now imagine that there is water flowing through a cell that's full of organelles, and then it's got to pass through some sort of, well, they call it a sieve plate. So some sort of thing with holes in it at the other end of the cell. So the water's flowing through. What's going to happen to all those organelles? Well, yeah, they're going to flow up and they're going to clog up the works, right? If you had a bunch of mitochondria, they could all get jammed in this sieve plate, and that would prevent the water from flowing through very well. So what actually happens is, although the phloem cell is still alive, at maturity, their organelles actually degrade. So they don't have any of these active organelles. In order for the cell to stay alive, because they don't have a mitochondria and they don't have a nucleus, they still need the functions of those things. They still need to have proteins made, and they still need to be able to break down sugars, but they no longer have the structures that would do that. They have basically a life support system called the companion cell that's right next door. And so the companion cell is going to have a nucleus, the companion cell is going to have mitochondria, and it's going to do all of the cellular functions to keep this cell alive without having all the organelles in here to clog up the works. Does that make sense? All right, any questions about any of that stuff? Okay. All right, so let's start talking about how these different systems are actually functioning. Now that we've talked a little bit about the structure of the systems, let's talk about how they function. So, of course, plants need a lot of water and minerals that they're getting from the soil. You need to get a lot of things from the soil. And so plants are always in very close contact with the soil. They have to have a lot of of surface area. And so if you look at the root systems of plants, you'll see that oftentimes the root system is actually much larger than the shoot system. So in this little plant, this is a newly sprouting plant, it's gonna get larger. But you can see it already has a very large and complex root system, even though this is all that's above ground right now. So if you zoom in on these roots, what you're gonna see is, again, you've got all these branching roots, you've got lots of surface area just on the roots, but then if you look at the roots themselves, they're covered in root hairs. So lots and lots of surface area, so that there's a lot of contact with the soil. In addition to that, many plants have these fungal associations, right? Do you remember the mycorrhizae from the fungus thing? So in addition to all their own root hairs, oftentimes, and most of the time actually, plants also will have these mutualistic associations with fungal species that actually will grow on the surface of the root, and some of the hyphae of the fungus will actually penetrate into the root. And again, this increases the surface area even more, so they have even more contact with the surrounding soil. And the mycorrhizae really allow plants to absorb a lot more nutrients than they would be able to otherwise. Okay, other questions about this so far? All right. Okay, but sometimes plants are living in a really low nutrient environment. One of the limiting nutrients for a lot of plants is nitrogen. This is one of the primary components in fertilizer. If you ever have a plant, you fertilize your plant, most of the time you're putting in something that at least contains some nitrogen, because nitrogen is often a limiting factor. Where does the nitrogen that all organisms utilize to build our proteins and things come from originally? The atmosphere. So the atmosphere is about 80% nitrogen gas. Nitrogen gas is 2 atoms of nitrogen that are held together with a triple covalent bond. So it is a very, very stable gas. It does not break down easily. So in order to utilize that nitrogen gas, you have to go through nitrogen fixation. What's the only thing that can do nitrogen fixation? Nope. Prokaryotes, exactly. So prokaryotes are the only organism that can fix atmospheric nitrogen. And so there's a lot of these prokaryotes that live in the soil, and many times plants will form these symbiotic relationships with these prokaryotes in order to get access to the nitrogen they're fixing. And not all species of plants can do this. Some plants are better at it than others. So for example, on this plant root, you see these little nodules. These nodules are all full of these symbiotic nitrogen-fixing bacteria, okay? So what does the plant get out of this relationship?
Nitrogen?
Nitrogen. What does the bacteria get out of this relationship?
The host or?
Nutrients, support.
Well, what kind of nutrients specifically? What can the plant do? Photosynthesis. So the plant can feed the bacteria sugar, and the plant is fixing carbon, the bacteria is fixing nitrogen. The bacteria can't fix carbon, it has to get its carbon molecules from somewhere else. So the plant is basically feeding the bacteria, and the bacteria is providing this nitrogen. So when a plant is in a situation when it has low access to nitrogen, it actually will actively seek out these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So this is a plant, part of a plant root here. There's a little colony of nitrogen-fixing bacteria out here in the soil. And you actually get, what do you think this little structure is? I got a little clicker here. All right, click in if you haven't clicked. Anybody else? Everybody? Okay. So this is what it looks like. This is a root hair coming out of the side of the plant. the root hair can actually detect the nitrogen fixing bacteria, and it'll grow towards it and grow around it. And then it'll actually take the nitrogen fixing bacteria into the cell and transport it into the surrounding cells in the root, and then you form this nodule where the bacteria are actually living inside the cells of the plant. Okay? Let's say that you're a plant growing in super nitrogen-rich soil. You've got lots of nitrogen in the soil for whatever reason. Do you think you're going to bother to do this?
No.
No. It takes energy. You gotta grow this whole structure, and then you gotta feed your bacteria. It's like having a pet. You have to keep feeding it. So if you don't need nitrogen, you probably won't go through the extra energy to do this process. But if you're living in a nitrogen-poor environment, then this suddenly becomes advantageous. Okay, that make sense? All right. Okay, so now we're going to move on to how we actually move water and sugar over large distances. So some plants can be hundreds of feet tall. They still have to get water from the roots all the way up to the leaves and get sugar from the leaves all the way back down to the roots. This is my dog, wondering how plant transport works. I may have told him there was a squirrel in the tree. And this is a coastal redwood, which is the tallest living tree. So it's definitely a very big challenge. So there's a bunch of different things that are happening in order to move water and sugars around. We are going to be going through first water transport, and then we'll talk about sugar transport, okay? But there's a bunch of different components that actually play into that. All right, so water transport. There's two things that are important to remember about water transport. The first thing that has to happen is you got to get water into the vascular system in the roots. Okay, so you got to get water out of the soil into the vascular system in the roots. Okay, so that's the first step, is water uptake by the root. Once it's in the roots, then you have, or into the vascular system in the roots, then you have to move it around the body of the plant. So it's a two-step process. We're going to go through each step individually, okay? All right, so the first thing we're going to do is get the water into the root, right? So you've got your root. It's got a bunch of root hairs. What do you think all the root hairs are for? We already mentioned this, but what are all the root hairs for? All right, quick, if you have a quick. There's maybe two more people. Maybe? Two more people? There you are. Okay, cool. All right, so yeah, so as we were saying before, that surface area increases your efficiency at taking things in from the soil, including water. So a lot of times what's happening is that the water is going to actually be attracted to these root hairs, and it's going to help to move it into the root. So if you go in and you take a close look at a root, so here's our xylem. This is where we got to get the water to eventually. That's going to be the cell type that's going to transport water around the body of the plant, right? So our xylem's at the center of the root. This is just like a little pie part of a root here. It's not the whole root. So we've got our xylem here. We have what's called ground tissue. So these are just like general cells in the root. And we've got our epidermis, which is the outer layer of the root, with our root hairs. And what we generally see is that the cell wall, cellulose, is relatively attracted to water. And so water will come in and it'll travel along the cell wall. It won't actually go into the cells, but it'll travel along the cell wall between the cells, okay? And it'll move into the root that way naturally until it gets to this layer here. This layer is called the endodermis. It surrounds the vascular tissue, and the cells in the endodermis, rather than just having normal cell walls, they actually have they form a ring around the xylem where the cells are connected with a water impermeable substance called the Casparian strip. So the water can't move past this. It can't move between the cells because the Casparian strip will block it. All right. So it has to go through a cell. It has to actually go into a cell through a cell membrane to get into the xylem. Why is it important to keep the water from just flowing directly into the xylem? You get all the water. What else is in the water?
Contaminants and.
Yeah, so potentially there could be things that you don't want in the water. There's lots of stuff dissolved in soil water, right? Some of that stuff you might want if you're a plant, and some of that stuff you might not want. And so you want to control what goes into the plant. And the way you can control what goes into the plant is by forcing the water to go through a cellular membrane, all right? So rather than just letting the water flow straight into the xylem, the plant can have some control over what it takes in by forcing the water to pass through a membrane, all right? That make sense? Did you have a question or you just, all right, so it has to pass through a membrane. How is the plant gonna specifically get, let's say there's nitrogen in the soil, how is the plant gonna specifically take up those nitrogen-based compounds? Does anyone know how you can concentrate things within the cell? Maybe, maybe not. There's a process called active transport. Active transport is a type of transport across a cell membrane where you are moving substances against a concentration gradient. So you are taking them from an area of low concentration and moving them into an area of high concentration, all right? So for things that a plant wants, it allows it to concentrate those substances. If you are going against a concentration gradient, do you think that takes energy? Yeah. Anytime you move against a concentration gradient, it requires energy. So active transport is a process which requires some sort of energetic investment from the plant, okay? And then we're not gonna go down to like the molecular level, but just so you know what's going on, you've got your membrane in the cell, and there are what are called transporters in the membrane that will grab particular molecules on one side and push them through the membrane to the other side, basically. And as I said, we're not going to go into too much detail about those. There's a lot more you can learn about those, but you'll get that in 182. All right, so there's a lot of things that the plants want. The plants want nitrogen-based compounds. The plants want phosphorus-based compounds. They usually want magnesium. They want potassium. These are things that the plant needs for its health and survival. Okay, and so these types of compounds, when they are present in the soil, the plant is going to grab them. It's going to actively transport them into the cell. Okay, so this is what that looks like. So here's our little endodermal cell. The water that's come in here is carrying some of these ions, and the plant is actively grabbing the ions and pulling them into the cell. Okay, so what's happening now is that there's a lot more solutes or dissolved stuff in the cell than there is outside the cell, because the cell is pulling these dissolved things into the cell. That make sense? Okay. So next question is, because there is now a high concentration of dissolved stuff inside the cell, what do you think water molecules are going to do? Do you guys remember osmosis? Have you heard the term osmosis?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's the process. Can anyone define osmosis?
Water flowing along the concentration.
Yeah, so it's water moving down a concentration gradient across a cell membrane. Osmosis is a special case of diffusion. Okay, so diffusion is always random movement of molecules moving down a concentration gradient. Osmosis is random movement of water molecules moving down a concentration gradient across a cell membrane. Okay, so it's a special case of osmosis. Specifically refers to water, specifically refers to movement across a cell membrane. So what's gonna happen is that osmosis is gonna cause water to move into the cell, because if there's less stuff outside the cell, that means that there's more water. There's more water, less stuff, more stuff, less water, okay? So let's take a closer look at osmosis, because maybe some of you need a little bit of review on osmosis. As I said, osmosis is a special case of diffusion. It's completely passive. It does not require any energy. It's just, diffusion doesn't require any energy, and because this is a type of diffusion, it also doesn't require any energy. In fact, the plant really cannot keep it from happening. Water is such a small molecule, and it just moves through cell membranes. There's really not much a cell can do about that. If you've ever done, maybe you guys did an experiment sometime in high school where you had like blood cells and you put them in pure water and they all popped? No? They did that when I was in high school, but maybe they don't do things with blood cells anymore because they're worried about disease. I don't know. If you put a cell into something that is a solution, or not really a solution, if you put a cell into pure water, because there's more dissolved stuff inside the cell than outside the cell if you're in pure water, water just goes rushing in, and it usually will cause the cell to rupture. There's nothing the cell can do about it. Water's gonna diffuse across the membrane if there's a difference in water concentrations across the membrane. It's always gonna do that, okay? So osmosis is just always gonna happen whenever you have a difference in the amount of dissolved stuff between the two sides of the membrane. Okay, that make sense? All right, so let's take a look at a little example here. So here, this little square is a hypothetical cell. And the large blue circles here are representing a sugar, so a dissolved compound. The small blue circles are representing water. And so if you look at this cell here, in this, we're literally gonna count it as a simple example. What you're gonna see is that you've got 3 dissolved sugar molecules and 12 water molecules inside the cell, all right? So the concentration of water inside the cell is 12 out of 15, right? So that's the approximate concentration of water in here. For osmosis, you always have to think of it as a concentration of water, not the concentration of stuff. You need to know where you have more water and where you have less water, because that's going to determine which way the water molecules are going to move, okay? If you look outside the cell, in this pool here, we have also 12 water molecules, but we only have 1 molecule of dissolved stuff, so we have 12 out of 13 molecules, so that's our concentration, our water concentration outside the cell, okay? So the water concentration outside the cell, there's more water relative to other stuff outside the cell, less water relative to other stuff inside the cell. And so what you're gonna get is movement of water down the concentration gradient. So more water outside, less water inside, water's gonna move into the cell. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's go back to our plant example. In this case, where's the water concentration higher, inside or outside of the cell? Remember, we're talking about the water concentration, not the concentration of dissolved stuff, the concentration of water. It's a weird thing to think about. Just gotta kind of wrap your brain around it.
Did you put it outside?
All right, click in if you haven't clicked. There's maybe 6 of you who haven't clicked yet. Anybody else? Last chance to click. Okay. All right, so in this case, where do we have more dissolved stuff?
Inside.
Inside. Lots of dissolved stuff here. Lots of other stuff means less water because there's more other stuff. Outside, less stuff means more water. So the water concentration is higher outside the cell, and what that means is that the water is going to diffuse from the area of high concentration of water outside the cell to the area of low concentration of water inside the cell. So you're going to get diffusion into the cell. Okay, that makes sense? All right, so the plant, when it's taking up water into these endodermal cells, it is not actively moving the water. It's actively moving the other stuff and creating a high concentration inside the cell. And then osmosis brings the water in passively. So the plant's actually moving all of these other things, but then the water is gonna follow. So that's how it gets the water into the cell. That make sense? Okay, and now, it's got the water into the cell, and it's got all these other molecules that it also wants. So it's got the stuff that it wants from the soil, and it's got water, and everything is hunky-dory. And now the water can pass into the xylem, in the middle, and then it can move on to the rest of the plant, all right? So we've got the water and all these minerals that the plant wants inside the xylem. So now how do we get it from the roots all the way up to the top of the plant, okay? This is actually a process that we have to talk a little bit about the chemical properties of water in order to understand this process, all right? So remember, water is H2O, 2 hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom. Because of the way oxygen atoms are, the hydrogen atoms actually are going to attach not opposite each other. They're kind of at an angle. In fact, it's a 105-degree angle. There are physical reasons for this. I don't need you to know them. I just need you to know that you kind of get a Mickey Mouse shape. A water molecule looks like a little Mickey Mouse, okay? The other thing that is unique about the oxygen versus the hydrogen is that they're sharing an electron. It's a covalent bond, and the oxygen atom wants that electron more, so it's pulling on the electron more. So the electron spends more time hanging out with the oxygen than it does hanging out with the hydrogens. So as a result, the oxygen has a slight negative charge. The hydrogens have a slight positive charge because the negatively charged electron is spending more time over here. This makes this a polar molecule, okay? That's what it means to be polar. You have partially negative charge on one side of the molecule and partially positive charge on the other side of the molecule. All right? That's a very short description of chemistry. I don't need you to know all of that electron stuff. I thought you might want to understand it. The important thing is that you know that the molecule is polar, and that a polar molecule has positively charged areas and negatively charged areas. All right. So what do you know about positively and negatively charged things?
They attract.
They attract each other, right? So when you have a whole bunch of water molecules together, the positively charged sections of one water molecule are attracted to the negatively charged areas of another water molecule. So you have this network of attraction between the water molecules. These are called hydrogen bonds. Again, that's not super critical that you know what those are called, but know that because water is polar, it's attracted to each other. So water molecules really like to be together, and they cling to each other. This is why water is liquid at room temperature. If you look at other very small molecules, like say carbon dioxide, which is a carbon and 2 oxygens, right? Carbon dioxide at room temperature is a gas. Many other molecules that only have a few atoms in them that are really small like that. Nitrogen is a gas. Oxygen is a gas. All of those molecules are non-polar. And because they're not attracted to each other, they tend to be gases. Whereas water, because it's attracted to each other, is a liquid at room temperature. And the fact that water is a liquid at room temperature is what makes life possible. So it's actually really, really important that these molecules cling to each other. All right. So this has a couple of different consequences. One is the water molecules are constantly clinging to each other. This creates surface tension. The water molecules would rather cling to each other than they would to other things. And so you get these things like droplets forming, and the surface of the water, you can actually have little animals that like walk on the surface of the water and things like that. This is caused by the cohesion of water molecules to each other. They also have adhesion, so they will also be attracted to other things with, that have a slight charge. And both of these things are actually important for looking at how water transport works. I'm trying to decide if I want to talk about this. Now, I think, since I'm at the end of the water description, I'm actually gonna stop here, because otherwise we'll get into the middle of something. And we'll pick this up on Monday, and have a nice